Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear us in the back? Yes. Good. I'm Nick Burns, professor here at the Kennedy School, friend and admirer of Ambassador Nigel Sheinwald, the UK Ambassador to the United States. We have worked together for many, many years in many different positions, and I want to welcome Ambassador Sheinwald back to Harvard University. The ambassador was here last year. He spoke on Pakistan and on the problems in South Asia and Afghanistan. I'm very grateful that in his two-day visit to Boston, to visit the British Consul General Phil Button, and to visit the governor and the president of Harvard University, he agreed to speak to our students. Ambassador Sheinwald is a veteran of the British Diplomatic Corps. He started the Diplomatic Corps in 1976. He served all over the world. He served in Washington in the 1980s. He served for 4 years between 2003 and 2007 as the Foreign and Defense Policy Advisor at 10 Downing Street to Prime Minister Tony Blair. He was a key interlocutor with our President, our Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, Steve Hadley, me, with many other people, a valued colleague, in my judgment, one of the finest diplomats that I know of, many countries in the world, and someone with great global experience. And so we've asked the ambassador to be here with you to talk about policies of the Cameron government in Britain, specifically the foreign and defense policies of that government. But I know that Ambassador Sheinwald will be happy to entertain questions on a wide variety of issues once we get to that. He does have a speech, and we'll deliver that now. But then we'll be happy to take your questions. I would just ask, when we come to the question and answer part of this event, that you would just state your name if you're a student, what you're studying here. That might help. Sure. And make sure that when you ask that question, it has a question mark attached to the end of it. That's always very helpful for our speakers. So without further ado, Nigel, Ambassador Sheinwald, welcome. Thank you, Harvard. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction. And I said last time, when I was here about a year and a quarter ago, that it's no surprise to me that you ended up here after your incredibly distinguished career in the State Department, able to impart your very considerable knowledge and understanding of the world to probably an even harder audience than the audiences you dealt with in your former professional life. So it's a great pleasure to be here and back at the Kennedy School again. And I'm talking to you today as part of this project on future diplomacy, and allowed to talk about British diplomacy, British foreign and defence policy. But I want to say a word or two just at the beginning about Harvard. Harvard really is a key partner for the UK and for our top universities. And as Nick said, I had the privilege of meeting President Faust again this morning. Our government has a very wide-ranging interaction with the university, obviously on all types of academic cooperation and exchange, but in the subject areas as well, in the areas of public policy, on foreign and security policy, which we'll be talking about today, but also on business affairs, on financial issues, on science and innovation. And I'm very pleased to report that in this year, which is the 375th anniversary, or soon to be, of Harvard's founding by British Puritans, that the relationship is in such good shape, and I'm sure it will remain so. Now, Nick asked me to talk about the impact of the financial crisis on our government and its effect on our foreign and defence policies, including our relations with this country and with the rest of Europe. So the title is British Foreign and Security Policy in an Age of Austerity. And my starting point in this is a conventional one, that the success and vitality of a country's foreign policy does depend on a healthy economy at home. And our Prime Minister made this clear in introducing the Strategic Defence and Security Review, which completed last autumn. He said the difficult legacy we've inherited has necessitated tough decisions to get our economy back on track. And our national security depends on our economic security and vice versa. It's exactly the same point that President Obama made at the beginning of the US national security strategy. He said, our strategy starts by recognizing that our strength and influence abroad begins with the steps we take at home. We must grow our economy and reduce our deficit. And students of history know that the Soviet Union is an extreme example of what happens to countries who forget these truths. It was memorably described by former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt as upper volta with missiles, and it showed that the massive Soviet military edifice of that day turned out to be built on economic quicksand. That's what we must all avoid. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk today about the situation that our government faced when it took office in May of 2010, the action that we took to consolidate our finances, and then spend most of the time talking about what that means for our global ambitions. Now, when the new government came into power last May, the situation really was difficult. The financial crisis hit everyone hard in the world, but particularly the developed economies. And according to the OECD, the US economy contracted by over 4% during an 18-month period in 2009 and 10. In Germany, the figure was 5.9% in 1 year, and the UK economy, which contracted by over 6%, was no exception. At the time the financial crisis broke, existing levels of UK national debt were not historically high, but the gap between the government's income and its expenditure was widening, and adding the cost of the bank bailouts and economic stimulus to these figures did change the picture dramatically. So at the time of last year's election, 1 in 4 pounds that the government spent was borrowed. We were paying at the rate of over $190 million a day, so about $69 billion annually in debt interest. And that was more money than being spent on British schools in a year. So in addition, the government inherited a number of unfunded spending commitments, including on defence projects, which, had they been unchanged, would have added to these already considerable burdens. So the assessment that our new coalition government made in their first weeks in office was that they had to tackle this debt. And Britain's ability to borrow at reasonable rates was starting to be called into question just at the time when the Eurozone was catching fire, first in Greece and later in the year in Ireland. And although the UK is not a member of the Eurozone, we are intimately connected to it, both geographically and economically, and we remain, of course, a leading member of the wider European Union. So as we saw in both Greece and Ireland, once investors lose confidence in your ability to service debt, you really have a battle royal on your hands. And it's as much about perception as reality. A loss of confidence means higher rates as investors add a risk premium to their lending. So it was genuinely important for the stability of the UK's economy for investors to see a credible plan for reducing borrowing. And if we hadn't acted early, we would have faced much more drastic action later under a great deal more pressure. So against that background, what the government did in its emergency budget in June of last year, and then in a major spending review in October, was produce a set of decisive measures to restore that fiscal credibility. We announced a series of cuts to public spending and some tax increase, notably in our value-added tax, to bring the deficit down from 11% last year to 1% in 2015. And that was intended to re-establish confidence in our public finances. Now, the cuts averaged 19% across central government, with a particular focus on reducing welfare costs and wasteful spending. The short-term payoff was clear. Our market interest rates fell to near record lows, and the UK's top credit rating of being at risk was reaffirmed. Now, that wasn't easy, and isn't easy. And while schools, health and overseas aid have been protected in this review, other areas do face real challenges. Of course, there's a lively and necessary debate in the UK about these decisions and about their implications. Everyone agrees that the deficit needs to be tackled, but there is a division, as there is in this country, over how quickly that should be done. The opposition in the UK, the British Labour Party, wants steady growth restored before cuts are enacted. But the experience of Ireland, together with forecasts of the new independent Office of Budget Responsibility that we set up, and they say that the UK economy will continue to grow, all that supports the government's view that this policy is the right one for the UK in 2011. we don't believe that the fiscal measures that we've taken are in any sense optional. So we've now set out how we're going to bring the size of the public sector within our means. We're going to keep up investment in key infrastructure projects. We're going to be able to refocus the government's attention on the areas where it's most needed and can do most good. We're trying to forge a new model of sustainable growth based not only on a stable macroeconomy, but on increasing British competitiveness and attractiveness as a place to invest and do business. And our tax structures and our regulatory environment are going to reflect that. Now, foreign policy and defence can't be immune from those fiscal realities. So our budgets for defence, for national security and foreign policy have had to be cut according to the new fiscal cloth. But our government had first to ask itself a sort of prior question. Faced with these difficult economic facts, wouldn't we just prefer to turn our back on the world, reduce our commitments and opt for a quieter life? The government thought about that, but gave a resounding no to that question. We have concluded that's definitely not where our interests lie, rather the reverse. In today's networked world, the UK's extensive international political, economic and human links are a huge asset. And the only way to profit from globalisation is to participate and to contribute. Our Foreign Secretary, William Hague, made this clear in his speech at Georgetown University in November, when he said the UK would continue to be actively involved both in promoting our interests and in helping meet the major world challenges. So there will be no shrinkage of the UK's global role in the lifetime of this government. So we've tried to avoid, and think we have refused to accept, a zero-sum approach. We need to make substantial savings and ensure future strategic capabilities and global diplomatic reach. As I've said before, we retain some formidable assets. We're the 6th largest economy in the world. We have the 4th largest military budget, even after the defence review. We have one of the biggest international aid programs in the world, a unique set of alliances and relationships, and one of the world's largest global networks, diplomatic networks. Now we need to align ourselves with the world of this century, not the last, and the global landscape, as we all know, has changed dramatically, and as those of you involved in this project will honestly be aware. The international environment and the set of challenges that face us are now more complex. Globalization has led to a change in the balance of power, which is now more diffuse. The cast of international players is larger. Solutions to global challenges require, as we all know, the involvement not just of states, but of a much wider range of actors than has historically been the case. That was the background, the now conventional background to the Strategic Defence and Security Review we conducted last autumn. The first such review we conducted since 1998, so the first one to take into account 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan. And the challenge was to modernise our armed forces and our defence capabilities for this new environment at a time of budgetary pressure. Our review concluded our defence budget would decline by just over 7.5% in real terms over the next 4 years, and there will be real and sometimes painful savings, ending our presence in Germany, reducing our tanks and artillery, reducing our fast jets, rationalising our future programmes. But throughout, we kept 3 fundamental commitments. First of all, to protect our mission in Afghanistan. Second, to opt for future strategic capability rather than short-term fixes. And third, to ensure that we emerge in 2020 with a coherent defence capability. So we've designed a future force based on the sort of threats we expect we'll have to deal with, while preserving our ability to sustain the 2nd largest contribution to the NATO force in Afghanistan. We will remain America's most capable ally, as Secretary Clinton recognised last autumn. We'll remain the 4th largest defence budget in the world. We'll stay at or above the 2% of GDP target for defence budgets which NATO has established, and we're one of only 6 allies which meets this. And our future force will have a new carrier group based on the next generation aircraft carrier and the Joint Strike Fighter, the most capable fast jet in the world. We're buying new hunter-killer submarines and Type 45 frigates. We'll retain an army still capable of deploying and sustaining a brigade-sized force for all forms of warfare for long-term operations, or we can put a full division-sized force into the field for one-off contingencies, and we will renew our nuclear deterrent trident. We're investing in key areas of future significance and UK excellence and expertise. $1 billion is going into cyber capabilities, and we're going to build up our special forces, our intelligence and surveillance. And we'll cooperate even more closely with allies for effectiveness, but also for savings. With the US, of course, but we've also signed a new defense cooperation treaty with France, which is focused on developing complementarity between NATO's two most capable armed forces. Most capable European armed forces, I should say, of course. Getting the balance in the SDSR wasn't easy, but the government was determined to get both the strategic direction and the budget right. Now, at a time of limited resources, we have to use all our assets to best effect. National security doesn't just depend on the strength of our armed forces. It needs agile diplomacy, able both to prevent conflicts and to negotiate settlements, and it needs well-targeted aid, which supports the common good as well as our national security. So we needed a proper coordination mechanism. And our new National Security Council, a term which is familiar to you but new to us, brings together our ministers and our defense and intelligence chiefs each week to consider our strategic interests in the round and ensure that foreign policy runs through the veins of the whole government. It's already brought coherence to the oversight of Britain's effort in Afghanistan. It's agreed the strategic defense review I was talking about. It's agreed an underpinning national security strategy, and it's reinvigorating our relationships with all parts of the world, particularly the emerging powers, as well as enabling discussion of crises such as the recent events in Egypt. But making the most of our national assets isn't enough to achieve our international objectives in today's world, because the UK, of course, can't do everything by itself. So I want to talk now about the relationships that are central to our ability to project influence. You wouldn't always know it from the American media or indeed the British media, but the EU is an important global player. EU trade volumes total just over $3 trillion, only just behind the US, and that doesn't count the trade between members of the EU. The US exports and imports significantly more goods and services to and from the European Union than it does to and from China. That's $817 billion in 2009, compared with $319 billion between the US and China. European investment in this country totals nearly $1.5 trillion. And among in that group, the UK is of course your single largest outside investor. That compares with only 791 million of Chinese investment here. So that's less than 0.06% of EU foreign direct investment in the United States. So a tiny, tiny fraction. Today, this may change, but that's the situation today. In 2009, the EU spent a total of $66 billion on development aid, compared to just over 28 billion by the United States. We have 2 of the 5 permanent seats in the Security Council, 5 seats in the G20. We have over 2 million men under arms in Europe, and in NATO, many of our members are involved and part of a very successful military alliance. Now, we could debate, and maybe we'll have questions here, about whether Europe really maximizes that set of assets and that potential. But the point is that Europe does have weight in the world. And there are 3 principles governing the British government's approach to Europe. First of all, we don't want to transfer any further power from Westminster to the European Union, and we're legislating to guarantee that we'll provide a referendum should that situation arise in the future. Second, we do want the European Union to move away from an institutional focus in recent years and step up on the international issues and other practical issues that matter. In particular, we'd like Europe to do more and better in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which are top priorities for our national security, just as they are for the United States. And third, we want the EU to start behaving as, and be accepted as, a full partner in delivering foreign policy in the areas we both care about. In the Cold War, the US saw Europe as an object of its foreign policy, and that was inevitable. That arguably continued in the 1990s with the Balkan conflicts. But now, and particularly since the Lisbon Treaty strengthened Europe's ability to speak in a unified way internationally, Europe does have a bigger role to play in working with America in tackling the key issues of the day, whether that's Iranian nuclear proliferation or the Middle East peace process or countering the threat from international terrorism. Now, I should just add a word about the UK's economic relationship with the rest of the EU. As I said earlier, we're not part of the Eurozone, and we won't be, at least for the duration of this Parliament. Any decision would be subject to a referendum. So unless something dramatic happens, the reality is that the UK is out as far as the Euro is concerned for the foreseeable future. Now, there are obvious advantages for the UK in being outside. Exchange rate flexibility has allowed the pound to fall, making our exports more competitive on world markets. But we're equally clear that the Eurozone matters to the UK. That's, for example, why we contributed to the rescue package for Ireland, not just through the European Union, but also with a bilateral UK-Ireland loan. Now, it's not for the UK to dictate or suggest economic policy to the Eurozone, but our Chancellor of the Exchequer, the UK's Finance Minister, noted the need for the Euro countries to follow the logic of the single currency and stand more convincingly behind the Euro. And steps, of course, are being taken in that direction now. The freedoms created by the EU provide one of the foundations for the UK's prosperity. The countries of the EU remain our biggest trading partners. The emerging markets of India, China, and so on show greater potential, but we start, of course, from a much lower base. So improving the single market and making the EU competitive is something on which our government will continue to work actively. Now, as I said, economic growth, most economic growth is coming and will continue to come from the emerging markets, particularly in Asia. And the best illustration of this is China. At the same time as the other economies were shrinking during the recession, China is estimated to have grown by around 10% in 2010, according to the IMF, continuing the trend of phenomenal growth over the past 20 years. Now, the changes to the global environment that I've already mentioned mean that international relations are no longer dominated by a handful of powerful states. Emerging powers in Asia, Latin America, and Africa have an increasing voice in global affairs, economically through the G20, but also politically through regional groupings like the African Union. And we know that we have to engage with them if we're going to find convergent approaches to international problems. That's why, for example, the recent African summit in Addis Ababa was attended not only by African leaders, but by the US Deputy Secretary of State, a British Cabinet Minister, and a French President. So even if viewed simply from a narrowly commercial perspective, this increased engagement makes sense. The UK exports over 3 times more to Ireland than we do to the whole of Latin America, a region of 576 million people and 20 sovereign states. Our trade with Brazil, a country of almost 200 million people, is less than half our trade with Denmark. So to reflect this new reality, the UK has focused on rebuilding traditional relationships, for example with the Gulf states and India, and building new ones with Brazil and South America. And that's part of a deliberately activist foreign policy, which is itself a manifestation of our commitment to retaining global influence. And as well as seeking to maximize trade opportunities, we also aim to encourage these newly powerful actors to take more responsibility for international security. Their contributions have lagged behind their growing economic weight, notwithstanding India's significant involvement in UN peacekeeping operations, so it's good to see that changing now. For example, with India and China taking part in the naval anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. But however our partnerships with emerging nations may develop in the future, Britain's relationship with the United States is still the most important single bilateral relationship we have, what our government calls an unbreakable or indispensable alliance. It will continue to be central to UK security and prosperity in the 21st century. And from the outset, from last May, the UK government made clear the primacy of that relationship with the US. Indeed, within 10 minutes of arriving in 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister received a call from President Obama, who underlined his own commitment to that relationship. And David Cameron said in a speech in 2010, we'll continue to build on our special relationship with America. It's not just special, it's crucial, because it's based on solid practical foundations, such as our cooperation on defense, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and intelligence. And you could add to that list trade, finance, education, science, and very much more. Now, President Obama and Prime Minister Cameron have met a number of times already over the past 9 months, and that dialogue is supported by an excellent relationship between our Foreign Secretary and Secretary of State Clinton, who meet regularly in person and consult even more regularly on the phone. So the overall UK-US relationship is in excellent health. Our interests continue to be closely aligned, militarily, economically, and politically, and in a crisis such as the present one in Egypt, what happens is that our systems interlock and interact at ministerial level, between national security advisors, between expert policymakers, defense and intelligence analysts, and yes, embassies. And the watchwords of that UK-US foreign policy dialogues at a time like this are intensity, candour, and informality. It's a key part of how the UK does business internationally. And that's possible because, for the most part, we do enjoy a coincidence of views. We're working together across the foreign policy waterfront, our shared commitment to Afghanistan, on Iran and its nuclear program, the Middle East, counterterrorism, and so on. And our defense relationship, in particular, is one of the most intimate between any countries in the world. And that covers nuclear cooperation, the operations on which we fight together, most notably at the moment in Afghanistan, and a constant exchange between us of ideas and people in order to maintain our capabilities and our ability to act together. Now, we don't agree on everything, but where we differ, we say so as candid friends. Now, of course, the US is investing a great deal of effort in new partnerships with China, India, and other major powers, and we're doing precisely the same. But in international relations, there's also an important place for alliances. Allies share your values as well as your interests. Whether you're constructing coalitions for action on world economic issues, or poverty, or climate, or energy, whether you're trying to promote democracy and human rights in the Middle East, your allies can and do help, let alone when the United States needs to form a military coalition in Afghanistan or elsewhere. So while alliances can seem boring and predictable compared with the novelty of new global partnerships, they should not be taken for granted and are needed as an essential building block in international relations. As Winston Churchill said, there is at least one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is to fight without them. So my conclusion is the budgetary challenges that we as a government faced are not going to change the nature of the transatlantic relationship. We see austerity as a phase, not a permanent condition. Meanwhile, in the UK, we're going to maintain our global role. We'll be ready, as the Prime Minister said, to increase our defence expenditure once the economy improves later this decade. And Britain is going to remain America's most capable ally, rather leaner and tauter, more conscious of the need to put our economy first, but still with an impressive global network and the will to act to advance our shared goals. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I want to open up the questions. Before I do, I want to take the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question. I was remiss in not saying, with Catherine Kluver here, that the Future of Diplomacy Project is a sponsor of this speech. She's our executive director of this project. This is a new project at the Kennedy School meant to draw attention to the importance of diplomacy in international politics and security affairs, with no better person to exemplify that. I also just wanted to say to the ambassador, I was intrigued by how he started this, meeting with President Faust. Harvard is a British institution, when the ambassador was here a year and a half ago, we saw President Faust together, and they discussed the fact that Harvard was actually a British institution for the first 140 years of Harvard's existence. That's how far back Harvard goes.
You've got over it. So,
well, let's put it that way. First question. And then I think the ambassador will entertain questions from all of you, any of you who would like to ask them. I agree with you, Ambassador Sheinwald, Nigel, that Britain is a first-class military power. As a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, there is no question in my mind that Britain is the strongest military power in Europe. I suggested to my class today that Britain, I think, after the United States, is the strongest global military power. Because Britain has the capacity to deploy its forces and to sustain them globally in a way that China and India do not at the present time. Indeed, no other country in Europe is doing. So the question is, will Britain retain the military, the capacity through defense spending to deploy a 21st century military technologically? And after several hundred years as a global military power, will Britain retain the mindset and will to act globally, not just as a result of these events?
As I tried to say, I'm pretty confident that is where we are today. I can't predict for the future. I think all our, in the UK and US, we've both been through an extraordinary decade. Obviously, we've been through Iraq. We are still in Afghanistan. We're still facing, as you are, very heavy losses in Afghanistan. So the circumstances in which countries like the UK and the US deploy force in the future are going to be very, very carefully weighed. That goes without saying after the experience of the last decade. But for the UK, the intention behind our defence and security review and the will of the government is that we will indeed be ready to take that action again when necessary. And in technical terms, as I said, we think we are upscaling the capabilities and the technologies of the future. As I said, we're going to be spending a lot more money on cyber. Whatever the world looks like in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to need better intelligence, better special forces. The UK is good at that, and will invest more money in those areas. And if we do need another Afghanistan-type operation, we will have the numbers and the capacity to keep the sort of operation that we have today in Afghanistan in the field. Slightly smaller numbers than we have today, but we're going to be able to keep 7,000 or so people on a long-term operation, as well as put 30,000 people on the ground for a short time if you needed to conduct a major military intervention for a short time abroad. So those are the numbers and the facts about defence review. So it doesn't look significantly different from the sort of capability that you've seen deployed over the past decade. And that's the intention. We will remain a militarily extremely potent player. But like you, like the administration, like others in the United States, we believe in a term I think someone in this building coined, the concept of smart power, which aligns your military capabilities with the broader political and economic assets that you have. We believe in that profoundly. If you look at a situation like Iran, of course we've got to use sanctions. Of course you've got to use the economic power, financial power of sanctions. But the power of public diplomacy is also very important. The power of engaging in a sort of battle of ideas is important. And one of our most important assets in relation to Iran is the fact that we as a country invested a few years ago in a BBC TV Farsi service, which is very, very well used in Iran, and which is an incredibly valuable source of impartial information to a number of people who are starved of that. So you need to look across the board at your assets. You want to talk about global engagement. We believe we're doing that. As I say, our aid program is one of the few bits of government expenditure which will actually increase dramatically in the years ahead, as planned, so that we reach the 0.7% of GNP target for overseas aid, which has long been the UN target, and which very few countries reach. Unfortunately, the this will not happen for the United States for a very, very long time, if ever. But we will reach it in 2030 for the first time. And the fact that our aid budget is going to continue to increase despite the austerity I talked about is, I think, a sort of remarkable degree of commitment to the developing world. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Andrew Farrand, I'm a mid-career here at the Kennedy School. You noted that the UK is an important economy, and that Europe together is an important economy, and we sort of see a lot when sort of economic and political discussions are happening around the world that playing out. But relative to America, the military power does seem considerably less, both individually in the UK, notwithstanding the comments you just made, and Europe actually is a coherent force, regardless of whether there's 2 million fighting men there or not. Can you just discuss whether you feel that over the time as that sort of military power is reducing and reducing, when relative to other parts of the world, how that impacts the influence you think the UK and Europe has in each sense?
I tried to answer that. I mean, I think that there are always a number of ways of looking at the way that Europe performs. You can take a sort of glass half empty point of view, or a glass half full. And at different times of the day, I can give you a different take on it. I do think, if you look at it historically over the past 10 years, Europe, in terms of providing a security role in different places around the world, Europe has done more, not less, in the last 10 years. So it's been involved in Indonesia, it's been involved in Kosovo, it's been involved in Eastern Europe, in a number of security missions, which are somewhere between soft power and hard power. They're sort of peacekeeping, peace promotion in those areas. Sometimes humanitarian assistance with the military component. So I think that there's been an upscaling overall of the effort. There's a European effort against piracy off Somalia now, of course. Is another added element in that international effort. But there isn't a European army, and we're one of the countries which don't want one, and didn't want one when it was first proposed 10 years ago, don't want one now. And I think there are reasons for that, because when you're talking about defence, even more than when you're talking about foreign policy, you go deeply back into the roots of national power and sentiment. And we're talking ultimately about sending people in harm's way. And I think those remain national decisions. That's always been a British point of view about defence issues. So that's going to, in fact, is a widely shared view of Europe, and I think it isn't unanimously held, but it's widely held. It's going to limit the ability of Europe to be a full defence power. So it's going to have to work in concert with the individual countries, and they're going to be the ones who maintain the main national defence assets, armies, navies, and so on. So it's going to be a complicated, collaborative effort rather than a single European defence effort. And I think that's what we'll see. So that's where we are, I think, with Europe. I mean, overall, Europe has done more in the last decade than in its previous life as an international institution. Where, as I said in my remarks, we think it needs to do more is in areas like Afghanistan and Pakistan, where you not only have in Afghanistan a NATO contribution, which a number of European countries are making, where again some could do a little bit more than they're doing at the moment, but overall there's quite a high level of European involvement in the ISAF mission. But in terms of the financial commitment, both to Pakistan and Afghanistan, there's a good deal more that Europe can do. We in the UK put in a huge amount of money into both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that sense of urgency and priority is perhaps not shared by the majority of our European partners. So we'd like to see that scaled up in the period ahead. There was a lady back. Yes, please. And then,
Hi, I'm Joanne Burke. Thank you, Ambassador. It was very interesting. I had a specific question about the financial crisis. and was just wondering how much the sort of lack of transparency vis-a-vis the banks versus their global peers may have contributed to the financial crisis. I noticed today the HSBC and Lloyd's moved to a quarterly quantitative reporting versus semi-annual, and what the UK or the administration was planning to do, how to address potential systemic risks in the banking system going forward.
Well, our government at the time said that that was probably the key issue. If we go back to that period in 2008, the height of the crisis, that point about increasing transparency on the part of the major financial institutions was probably the single thing that we talked most about at that stage. And of course, quite a bit of change has taken place in the sort of regulatory structures since then. That's one of the key points. We as our new government established a banking commission to look at the structure of banking in the UK, and they will report later this spring. And a sort of interim report was given by the chair of that a few weeks ago. And he did say that he was going to be looking at the ways in which our largest banks can maybe differentiate in their different types of activity. This is a familiar issue to you from the Volcker rule and what emerged in the Dodd-Frank legislation, but really looking at the extent to which under one roof and subject to the same rules you have both retail banking and the riskier investment banking. That's one of the things they're going to be looking at, and I think will come up with some proposals later in the year. So they do that, and then we'll come down to the
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Adya Shukla, and I am Science, Technology and Public Policy Fellow at the Kennedy School. Before coming here, I was based at University of Oxford, and it seems to me that the first victim of austerity in the UK is university research, especially research funding cuts in science and technology area. So it was nice to hear that UK government is actually paying attention to cyber security and allocated a huge amount of funding for that. But cyber security effort of any nation state can be organized through various lenses, like military lens, putting priority there, or civil society, or just investing into just pure technical infrastructure. So if the funding is being diverted to cybersecurity area, then I want to know, does the UK government has any very well organized cybersecurity strategy, how they are going to allocate investment and research effort into these three areas?
Well, I just want to go back to your premise, which I'm not sure was right, because I don't have the details in my head, but my recollection of our spending review was that we were trying to protect and ring-fence our high-level science and research budget. So I'm not saying that that means there isn't a single change, but by and large, that is a part of the budget which our higher education department announced is going to be protected. That's maybe a little bit different from...
So with respect, even University of Oxford and Cambridge had to significantly reduce their funding for physics and chemistry, nanotechnology. University of Sheffield and Manchester, they have shut down their departments, many departments. PhD funding by EPSRC in the UK have been reduced significantly. So I was even just referring to these recent changes, and many of the researchers in the UK are thinking about moving to the US.
Right. Well, it sounds like those things weren't very recent. They've already happened. They won't have been a reaction to what was announced only 3.5 months ago. So some of those things may have been things that happened a long way past. I don't want to joust with you on this, because you've obviously researched it extremely well. But the intention of the government, anyway, is certainly to protect our high-end research. And it's also the thinking behind a controversial measure, which you've all heard of, which is to increase tuition fees for students at British universities. And the idea there is going in the opposite direction from what you suggested. It is the ambition of the government is to maintain our place, second to the US, in terms of world-class education. It remains remarkable to me. If you look down those lists of top 50 or top 100, this university tends to do rather well in those lists. But so do quite a lot of our universities. And the two countries with by far the largest number of world-class universities are the UK and US, and we're determined to keep it that way, and believe we're very attractive to the worldwide academic audience. We're certainly still the largest recipient of American students anywhere in the world. That may change over time, but it remains the case. It remains the case today. I don't know the details of the $1 billion additional money which is going to go into this. I can see that going into a number of different areas, both industry, research, and also the activities of our government, our Ministry of Defence. We have something called Government Communications Headquarters, which is like your national security agency, only it's non-military. So the number of government agencies which will be involved in this. Interestingly, our Foreign Secretary last Friday at a conference in Germany announced that we'll be holding a conference in the UK later this year on the issue of cybersecurity to look at the issue of standards, relationships, relationships with industry and so on. So that might begin to answer some of the questions which you were raising.
Thank you.
This is a lady there, and then the gentleman here.
Ambassador Philip Thomas, I'm a Neiman Journalism Fellow, formerly BBC, which is where we went before.
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed.
And so, thank you for your speech and your focus on smart power. And perhaps inevitably, I want to ask you about your Foreign Office divesting itself of funding for the BBC World Service, because some might say that's short-sighted in that context.
Well, I think I mean, we're not saying that the World Service is unimportant. What we're saying is that it's not going to be on the Foreign Office's budget any longer. It will be a responsibility for the BBC at the end of this period. So it will move off the Foreign Office's books, as it were, and become part of the BBC's overall funding. So if you look at what the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister and others have said, there is an absolute understanding of the importance of this to the British brand, the understanding of Britain internationally. It was always a slightly odd arrangement. It was an arrangement whereby the Foreign Office funded the BBC World Service, or at least a good deal of it. My sense is that in recent times, of course, there was also help from some of your commercial activities, which might have gone power back into the World Service. But the main funding always came from the Foreign Office. But of course, absolutely rightly, the government never had any editorial involvement, still less control. That's always been the position. So would it not be in a way simpler and more honest for this not to be funded by the government itself? So I think that's the rationale. That's the rationale behind it. That money will be transferred to the BBC, and that budget will be handed over to the BBC, and it will then up to the BBC to work out how to handle it. They've made a number of spending decisions already, going actually well beyond the cuts which will have emerged from the actual change in the budget. So
No problem for smart power.
no, I think it's a problem for smart power only if the BBC reduces the service over the years. I mean, it's a sort of transfer of responsibility. It's not saying the BBC should spend less on the World Service than now. It's really cutting off the budgetary responsibility from the FCO and retaining essentially a core Foreign Office budget for the things we are actually responsible for, because we're not actually responsible for the BBC World Service. Is this gentleman here? Maybe it should be one on the other side. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Nathan Hanaff, I'm a first-year master's degree student here. I really appreciate the speech. I think you made a very convincing case for, despite the budget cuts, that the UK will be able to remain the U.S.'s principal security partners, especially I'm sure the Americans are relieved particularly in regards to Afghanistan and maintaining their commitment there. But you mentioned that some areas where you would cut would be sort of fixed and heavy forces, particularly in Europe, places like Germany United States facing very similar budget difficulties in many in the U.S., including Secretary Gates, talking about reducing our own defense spending. What would be your response to a similar approach that those in the U.S. Believe that we should reduce our defense spending in similar areas in Europe that are these fixed, heavy Cold War type military assets to Germany and other places? What would be the UK's response to that? Do you believe that the UK is able to sort of get along fine if those cuts were to happen?
Well, generally speaking, I think that's inevitable. I mean, all of us are under financial pressure. The pressure certainly is building here on the US fiscal position. We haven't had to take decisions in quite the time frame that we've had to take. They're coming, as Secretary Gates and everyone else that I speak to in Washington is saying, including the defense industry. So I think, you know, any reappraisal of your defense budget must start with the threat and with the requirement. And obviously that has changed dramatically since the end of the Cold War. And it's only right that your force structure and spending patterns should reflect that new reality, as it is for us. So we'll do it in stages, but by 2020 we won't have a presence in Germany, and that's being done with the consent and agreement of the German government. And I'm sure if there are any similar American plans, that will also be done in a consensual and cooperative way. You have to put your money where it's most needed, as I say, in the future technological capabilities and in the ability to deploy really useful things around the world to face conflicts of tomorrow. There was a lady at the back, right? I think, was it? Yes, please. Yes.
My name is Chen Zheng. I'm a visiting fellow at S Center, and I'm taking Professor Burns' class. Back in China, I'm working for Beijing Foreign Studies University, to educate diplomats. So I've been to UK twice. I stayed in University of Cambridge, and it's a lovely university. Really enjoy the scenery and economic environment. Here is my question. I'm more interested in China-UK relations. For the past decades, UK is one of our major partners in EU, and but however, the relations between China and the UK is not so visible as China and the US. So I would like to know what can we do to further promote the China-UK relations? Thanks.
They may not be here, but they are to us. You know. I think one of the, and I worked on this when I was at 10 Downing Street, as Nick mentioned. I worked for 4 years at 10 Downing Street, and actually one of the things that we were doing, we were doing lots of things, and one of them was indeed getting our relationship with China onto a fundamentally new level. And I think each government that we have in the UK has wanted to do that in the last 10 to 15 years. In my time there, we started a new strategic foreign policy dialogue with China, which I took part in, and that's been expanded and strengthened since. So, you know, David Cameron was in China in November. Inevitably, that's not going to get the same coverage as a visit by President Hu to America or by President Obama to China here a bit ago. So I think that's just inevitable. But for us, you know, that is an incredibly important relationship. As I said, everyone in Europe, countries in the developed world, are putting a huge amount of emphasis on forging a new type of partnership with China for the last few years and in the period ahead. And that has an important strategic foreign policy component. It has a trade and economic component. And also, you know, it's very important to discuss those big global issues like climate and energy, in which China is a major player, as the result of Copenhagen showed. So I think that, you know, for us, this is a very important relationship. I don't know what I can do to get it better publicized here. I have to think about that. but it's a very, very big bit of what the thinking going on in the Foreign Office day in, day out. Yes, please, and then maybe one on the back.
Hi, my name's Natalie Black. I'm a student here at Kennedy School.
Right.
One of the topics that didn't come up in your speech was immigration policy. The new government has made a number of statements, and yesterday in an Indian newspaper I saw a headline, Indian MBAs not welcome in the UK. So I was wondering what you thought about the current policy statements that are coming out of Number 10 and how that will affect our foreign relations and also our competitiveness.
Well, from my vantage point, I've mainly been looking at that from the perspective of the United States. And I have to say, so far, that the announcements that have been made, which have been on essentially, that we haven't dealt with students yet. There's been a separate review, the results of which will be announced later on students. But basically, as far as business travellers and other travellers are concerned, there will not be sort of major changes as far as the United States is concerned. One of the things that American companies were most worried about were these things called intra-company transfers. So if you're an IBM or you're a DuPont and you're trying to transfer someone from around the world to the UK, what should be the immigration terms of that person going in? All those people have really been exempted from the immigration cap which we've imposed. So I think what the government's trying to do is certainly listen to the business community in terms of expanding our business needs, and it's very, very keen to make sure that we expand and continue to expand our educational links as well. And my hope is that as far as the huge academic exchange between the UK and the US at undergraduate but also at postgraduate level, that won't be affected, because I think one of the criteria is likely to be whether you're on an established course or not. And most of the people who are involved between the UK and the US are very much on established and recognized courses. That isn't the case all the way around the world, so that's what's going to have to be looked at. But all countries have to look at immigration, as you know. It's not something which is just sort of dreamt up in a sixth form politics class in the UK. It's a real issue of concern for publics in all of Western Europe, in this country and elsewhere. And I think it's a question of getting the balances right. But we have to do this in a way which keeps Britain open for business and open for academic and student exchange. And I'm pretty confident as far as this country is concerned that will be the case. We're going to do one of these gentlemen at the back. Yeah, why don't you go first, and then you, and then the gentleman with the striped jumper.
Thank you very much, and that's my name's Simon Rao.
Too many Brits. Now come on.
Actually, I'm Australian, but
okay, all right. That's the kindest remark I could make.
Let that one slide. Thank you very much for your speech. I had when the new government came in, they very much emphasised trade promotion as being the heart of their diplomatic agenda. And I was just wondering how, in your experience, has diplomacy for the UK changed in that regard? And because of the increased emphasis on trade promotion, has there been any areas which have been de-emphasised, I guess, deprioritised as a result of that?
I certainly welcome the emphasis on commercial diplomacy, as we call it that. It's not something that we only started doing from May of last year. It's something which our government, like other governments, the US government is one of them, have been doing for a while. But I think that the purpose of this was to do two things. We make sure that we, as an arm of the government, did this in the most professional and integrated way. So it's not just, for us in this country, for example, it isn't just helping our UK Trade and Investment Organisation to work with American companies and British companies to trade and invest more in each other's country. It's also getting our policy teams active on the regulatory environment in this country, which is sometimes not as benign as in the UK. There are quite a few headwinds of protectionism in America, and we're very often dousing little fires of protectionism that we don't like. So you have to be joined up in that way. And your public policy teams, your media and press people, need to be very active in promoting the UK's economic reputation and talking about these issues, talking about my own in an open way, because I was trying to say in my speech, I'm not going to pretend that this scale of change in the UK's fiscal policies is without debate or division or controversy. Of course it is. And it's right to debate those and make it clear to people. So I think you have to join all that up, and that's what the job of an embassy is, to make sure that, in our case, an embassy, 9 consulates general around this country, are working on this in an integrated way between our investment promotion people on one hand, our trade policy people, and our public affairs people. But the second thing is an international policy point. One of the things David Cameron has talked very passionately about is seeing trade as really one of the win-win and relatively straightforward things to do, to promote as part of the international recovery. So we would like to see the Doha round of international trade talks being given new life, and if possible, completed this year, because our worry is that if it doesn't happen this year, then 2012, with an election here and the leadership change in China, is not necessarily going to be the most conducive environment to get it. So do we wait till 2013? By then we'll be 12 years on from the start of the round, and I think people will be starting to get fed up and wondering whether this really is worth keeping. So we would say in the UK, being very instinctive and committed free traders, and our economy is amazingly open, we would say that that's another very important part of the new international scene that we need to get right after the recession. So I think the two things are linked. There's going to be that gentleman there. Then you,
Thanks very much. My name is Robert Hughes. I'm a student at the School of Public Health here. I wanted to ask a bit about the Strategic Defence Review, and in particular the last thing you mentioned on the list of things that were happening, and that was the replacement of Trident.
Yes.
And you talked about how the Defence Review was about working out what sorts of threats we might need to address. I wonder if you could expand on the sort of threat that you think the blunt instrument, that is the nuclear deterrent, is really likely to be needed for in the next 20 to 30 years.
Well, this was explained in the Defence Review, and of course it goes back to a review which was conducted, I think, at the end of 2006, where we did a focused review on this issue. And I think the conclusion of the present government was, in an age, I suppose to sum it up, in an age of uncertainty, it would be imprudent to do without our final and ultimate insurance policy. That's probably to sum it up. And I think that remains the case for the UK. A country like the United States has a much broader range of conventional power to use in deterrence. The UK and other Europeans, France and other countries at that scale have less. Having the nuclear deterrent does provide that essential certainty for us. And we don't know over the period that we're talking about, because you have to plan for decades and decades ahead. We simply cannot predict that there won't be a threat which requires that sort of deterrence again. We maybe don't see it today. We make clear that we're of course not talking about handling terrorism or sort of Al-Qaeda type terrorism that we confront. But there are situations that one could imagine in the world of 2030, 2040, 2050, where it would be necessary. We're definitely not doing it simply to retain a place at a high table for political reasons, for foreign policy reasons, just to be in the club. We're doing it because we believe it's an important part of our overall defence posture and makes sense for the UK. We're doing it as cheaply as we can, and we make no apology for that. We're doing it with the minimum deterrent. We've reduced the number of warheads and firepower consistently, made further decisions on that in the strategic defence review. We believe that that is the best way of explaining it to British public opinion, to do it at the minimum, at the absolute minimum level. Those decisions were taken, as I say, by the Labour government in recently reinforced by the present government, as well as finding a little bit more life in the present generation of submarines, which means that we won't need to replace the present group until 2028, which sounds like a hell of a long way off, but being more probably my age than some of your age. We does seem a long way off, 2028, before we even get to that first point of the new submarines coming from the EU. So it's a very, very long-term decision. I think it's difficult to be more precise than that. It's a sense that we're going to need to continue to reinsure. Who are we going to do? We're going to do you, and then we have this gentleman here. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm John Evans. I'm doing a master's in peace and studies. And you mentioned that the age of austerity might produce a leaner, more efficient security and defence build-up, but also that it would be a temporary measure rather than building. Do you think that some of the benefits you might get for it, focusing more on cheaper, more effective methods, will be abandoned and paused? Will this leanness be a sort of January diet that will be abandoned when we can? Or will there be longer health benefits for it?
Well, I hope we get the best of both worlds. I mean, I think what the Prime Minister said when we announced this was that he obviously he can't commit a future government. We'll have an election in May of 2015. Obviously, he would hope to be the Prime Minister after that. He said that if he is, then his intention is to have our defence budget increase in real terms in the 5 years of the next Parliament after this one. So that's what he's said as a political commitment for the future. But I think that particularly relates to things like the size of the army, the size of the other armed services, the number and structure of our fast jet force. I mean, these are things which we will not need to decide to go beyond the decisions which have been made in the present strategic defence review, which will have to be looked at again early in the life of the next Parliament. Our army, for example, will come down in the next 5 years only from just over 100,000 to about, I think, 96,000. So it's not a significant change, and the reason for that is that we're going to need that number to maintain our position in our presence in Afghanistan until 2015, when we've said that our combat role will end, but obviously will continue with a training role, with a political and economic role after that. Yes, this gentleman here and then behind.
That's fine. Before I started at Central Public School, I did a master's degree from that, which is system history.
Right.
And now I'm studying at the Marxism school, taking when I come here, I talked to professors, on matters and surprised with my education. He said, it's a Marxism school in Peking University. Even in China, it's a surprise. And now the Ministry of Education in China requires all key universities must set up a Marxism school. Now about 50 Marxism schools in China affiliated to Chinese universities. And I also want to mention before emphasize that Marx was a very high
Highgate.
Yes. Highgate,
not Hyde Park. Highgate, yes.
The first question is that Western people, how many Western people admire Marx? Many people go to the high time to see how Marx. The second question is that, until now, our party, CCP, especially on its Congress, in the report, still emphasize the guideline is Marxism, Leninism, and we still emphasize the ideology of Marxism. And maybe now it's like socialism with Chinese characteristics, social development view, a little different, but we still emphasize Marxism. Do you think this kind of ideology influence the foreign relationship with other countries? How does it influence the foreign relationship with the so-called capitalist countries like the UK and US?
Yes. Well, it's a very good question.
The second question is that now China has set up about 300 conversion schools in worldwide. I have asked the person for professor, but he didn't answer. I said that if China set up 300 Marxism schools worldwide, what the world will respond?
Well, I'm going to try and answer that honestly, if I may. I mean, I think that the true answer, as far as the UK is concerned, I don't know about other countries, is that relatively our foreign policy over the centuries and over the recent decades has probably been at the pragmatic and non-ideological end of the spectrum. It may not look like that from the outside, but I think in Britain it will be viewed that way. Sometimes criticised for being unprincipled, or in the sense that we try as a habit of our national character to look at the world as it is, rather than the world as it might be or might ideally be. And I think the honest answer to your question about Marxism is that among, in academic circles, if you're in a history faculty, if you're in a political science class, of course people will still use Marxism to some extent as a lens through which to view world events, and it may be part of the spectrum of theoretical possibilities that people look at. But by and large, it isn't a widely admired point of view, or widely believed point of view, because it certainly, as far as my country is concerned, most ordinary people would not see it as reflecting the world that they see around them. I think most people probably don't believe that it reflects the human spirit and the human character that they see. But they're not in rebellion against it. It's just seemed in the end to be largely irrelevant to the way that the world today has worked out. You'll have your own views. This is me talking rather than the government talking.
This will be the last question.
Okay. Sorry, it was going to be this lady first. Yes. Our chat afterwards.
Thank you, Ambassador. Karen Pierce, I'm also studying here at the Kennedy School. I think it's very encouraging that this government has maintained the commitment to spend 0.7% of GNP on aid by 2030 as the size. But we're also hearing this government talk a lot more about aid in a security and foreign policy context to some extent. And obviously we all recognise the security benefits of aid. But over the last 15 years or so, DFID has built up a very strong theory and practice of development, which is focused on governance, on effective delivery of services, on transparent delivery of services. And also if you look at the regional allocation of aid, there are a number of places which are very significant for DFID, like Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, alongside places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. There's other places which would not be at the top of the list if you're applying a security and foreign policy lens to your development budget. So just a question for you, how much do you think either the nature of aid or the delivery mechanisms or the regional allocation might change under the current government in the next 5 years or so?
It's a very good question. I don't know the precise answer to it. Remember that in the UK, unlike here, we have a completely separate, you know this, I'm just saying it for the rest of the audience to say, we have a completely separate Department for International Development, headed by its own member of the cabinet. It's not, as it is here, within the Foreign Office, as it used to be. So that reform, which was introduced in 1997 by the Labour government, is being maintained by the present government, and gives DFID its own existence and autonomy in the way that they operate. And the main lens will continue to be the criterion of poverty and acting to reduce over time eliminate that. I do think though, when you're looking, certainly in India, India is not going to be a growth area for British aid. But Afghanistan and Pakistan, using the poverty criteria, are actually perfectly legitimate major recipients of aid. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. Pakistan definitely as well. Our aid program in Pakistan is increasing enormously, particularly in the areas of health and education. Education is one of the areas we do a huge amount in Pakistan, and that is probably one area which aligns perfectly and effortlessly with the security objective, because if we're able to do more there on education, then it obviously plays into the whole issue of the sort of motivation for extremism and for radicalization within the Pakistan population. So I think the main lens will be that, but how you spend it, how much you spend, may have more of a security factor. One thing that I think is very welcome is the sense of DFID, our Department for International Development, working closely with the other arms of government, being an integrated part of our government, rather than being, as it is sometimes seen, to one side and acting purely independently. It needs to work in coherence with the rest of the government, but have its separate aims and activities under its own legal act, which of course it's had since over the past decade.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador Sheinwald. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.